was writing this book, I had a conversation with my wife, a couple of them actually, and I said, honey, I picked the wrong topic to write about because nobody in this country cares about this. I'm out writing about this. People are dying, and nobody wants to talk about it. It was like 2013. It was not that long ago, 2013, 2014. And those of you who've been working on this a long time, I suspect that might be a lot of you, know how hollow, how the echo wasn't there. You just could not get people to care about this. And my wife and I have been walking around in a daze for the last 2 years to watch what the response to the book is. So those of you who've read it already, thank you so much. On behalf of my wife and my little daughter, we are stunned. I'm amazed that I'm even here. Thank you to Ben Chandler. Thanks so much. John Tilley earlier, thanks very much for I caught part of your talk as well. The folks at Operation Unite, I met Carl. I saw Carl. Where is anybody else from Operation? There you guys. How you doing? Thank you all very much for your prayers. Some of you may know the last time we met, I had a heart attack. Not because I met him, but I had a heart attack in a high rise in Atlanta, Georgia, and lived obviously to tell about it. But I do appreciate your good thoughts and prayers, and on my behalf, my wife and I were very, very touched by that. We cried a lot about that whole situation. One of the amazing things was in the middle of all this, I have a massive coronary, Anyway, thank you all so much for being here. It's really, really sweet, and your great comments. I love meeting people, and it's been wonderful. So. Thank you. It's just so great. I thought today that I would dispense with the talk that I normally give because it's normally to people who really are still kind of new to this topic, and I understand a lot of you are not. I would say that I'll try to talk a little bit about what are some of the major themes, I guess, or ways of thinking, I think, about what we're experiencing as a country, because it is as a country. I was in Hawaii 2 days ago, okay? Utah for that, Raleigh before that. I'm going to Virginia tonight and to Milwaukee after that. So you could see I'm going to Alabama, I'm going to Vermont. It's all over this country. What's happening here may have started here first, or early on, but really is not it's now a national issue without a doubt. I think most of you know that this starts because of a revolution in American pain management and American medicine. People believing that we had an epidemic of pain. They were probably right. There was a poor way of handling pain back in the 80s, early 90s. We didn't do a very good job of that. But the young specialists, the pain specialists who made that argument, kind of viewed themselves as revolutionaries, wanted to break down kind of old ways of thinking. And so they didn't stop with an idea that we should be using these painkillers more for very often for terminal cancer patients who only had 3 months to live. They began to say, no, we need to use these for all kinds of things. And that idea eventually took hold. It took hold because changes in the medical establishment began to kind of glom onto this. I think pharmaceutical companies saw that this was a magnificent opportunity to sell more of their pain management tools, which are largely narcotic painkillers, and push this idea along as well. And I think a lot of it had to do with changes in American culture, I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But I think one of the consequences of all this was a corollary to the idea that these pills, that the argument they were making was that these pills were now known to be virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain. That means what it meant was, the corollary was, it didn't matter how many of these pills you prescribed. And so you began to see through the 90s, doctors prescribing pills for all manner of, dentists for wisdom tooth extraction. And it wasn't just that they were prescribing, it was the quantities, I think, was really the key in all this. You could go in for a minor surgery for which the pain was going to last 2 days, 3 days, and you would end up with 30 days worth of pills and probably a couple of refills after that. And so an enormous supply of pills began to slosh around the country, exploded. I think 96 was an important year in all this because that's the year that Purdue Pharma released OxyContin. You're well aware of that, I'm sure. Mostly what was important about the way that initially was that the way they promoted it. They promoted it to doctors, particularly trying to get older doctors over the fear of addiction when they prescribed these things. So they promoted them like over-the-counter medicine with fishing caps and calendars and pens, and there was a coupon for a week's worth of free OxyContin. There was a famous CD that they gave away called "Swing in the Right Direction" with OxyContin. You guys seen this? Swing in the right direction with a couple on the cover of a CD, walking through a garden, hand in hand, just swinging to OxyContin, with the Count Basie and his Andrew's sister swing band tunes on this CD. This was a time in America when the pharmaceutical industry as a whole was going through a Salesforce arms race. So every year they were hiring more and more pharmaceutical reps. 30,000 in 1993, I think the number was. 120,000 10 years later. They were tripping over each other, and they were younger folks. They were not so committed to the profession. A lot of them used to be enterprise rent-a-car salespeople. If you could sell, the idea was you could sell rent-a-cars, you could sell also computer gadgets and cell phones, which were just beginning at the time. You could sell pharmaceuticals, and a lot of them did. And in the end, what happened? Marketing worked. Doctors pushed, cajoled, pressured from many sides, began to buy the idea, okay, there's an epidemic of pain, and we need to prescribe it, and we now know that they're virtually non-addictive, so it doesn't matter how many of these things we prescribe. Pain management, in its initial stages, early on, went from was a specialty that spent a lot of time treating the whole person. So it was one person might get marital counseling and physical therapy and acupuncture and recommendations on diet and exercise, as well as narcotic painkillers as part of the mix. And in time, insurance companies stopped reimbursing for a lot of those therapies, and in time, the lone tool that doctors had were the pills. But at the same time, there was an attitude that grew up in the United States that we now were a country that expected very little pain. We believed we were kind of entitled to a life free of pain, and we had an unrealistic expectation of how much we ought to be asked to endure as a people, I think, grew up. And doctors were the folks who we expected to get that from. They were sued for not addressing our pain. They were sued when they didn't spend a lot of time pounding our pain down to zero, because that's what we demanded as American health consumers. So these pills were prescribed over and over, and massively overprescribed too at the same time, all across the country. OxyContin was the big game changer in all this. First for how it was prescribed, but then what happened later, for what happened later, because OxyContin, before OxyContin, there was no bridge to heroin. Right? Before OxyContin, you had people who would mess around with low-dose Vicodin, Percocet, but those pills had acetaminophen, they had Tylenol, and by the time you were developing a serious enough habit that made you desperate enough to think that you might want to switch to heroin, you had done massive damage to your internal organs. Most people didn't do this. A few people did, but really it was not common. But it's there where we were ignoring a major change in our drug supply, and that story takes us back a little bit before that. 1980s, up to the 1980s, almost a very, very large chunk of our heroin came from the Far East, right? Came from Burma. Turkey was where the French Connection dope came from. Turkey, Burma, Thailand, places like that. It got to our shores because it had so far to go. It got to our shores expensive and very weak, generally speaking. 1980s, all of that changes. Remember, these are years when the Colombian cartels are really fearsome, and the Mexicans are not quite there yet, but they're getting there. they begin to, along with the cocaine, comes heroin from both of those countries. It grows very nicely. The poppy grows nicely in those countries. And the heroin that they began to export, primarily in the 1980s and into the 1990s, really outcompeted, it was a business story, outcompeted the heroin from the Far East. So by the end of the 1980s, virtually all of our heroin came from Mexico or Colombia. It got here cheaper, much cheaper, in fact, as time went on, and a whole lot more potent. And nobody noticed, right? Because why? Because we were dealing with crack. We're dealing with meth, a whole bunch of other major priorities. There was important things. No one really paid any attention to the market for heroin until this new bridge came out called OxyContin. Then people had their addiction taken from small doses to very high daily habits, 150, 200, 300 milligrams a day. Sometimes the doctors would cut them off. They would lose their insurance. A variety of things would happen. They'd have to switch to the streets, where now a very robust market of pills was existing because of our overprescribing. And they would pay $1 a milligram on the street. And it was at that point, it was at that very moment when they were just stretched unsustainably. The $150, $200 a day habit could not sustain it. They began to look around for something, anything that is as potent and cheap, much cheaper. And it's at that moment when all of a sudden that change in our heroin market took place in the 1980s, becomes piercingly relevant. All of a sudden that becomes the alternative. We would not have a heroin problem today were it not for OxyContin, period. But we would also not have the kind of heroin problem we have today were it not for very, very cheap heroin coming from Latin America, increasingly today, of course, coming almost entirely from Mexico. But remember, that took place because of the pills. This was happening long before our switch to heroin. Remember, we surpassed as a country overdose deaths surpassed traffic fatalities due almost entirely to overprescribing of narcotic painkillers by doctors. Heroin really was not so much part of that story back then. This is an epidemic, the first example, I think, in modern post-war America of a drug scourge that did not start with drug mafias. It began because of millions of well-meaning docs believing something that wasn't always true in their attempt to help us solve our pain. And so slowly addiction spread. First, of course, through Appalachia and the Rust Belt. It spread because there was no violence associated. The first drug problem really where we did not see blood in the streets. On the contrary, crime was dropping as overdose deaths were rising. Made us feel like, well, maybe there wasn't really anything wrong. It dropped. It happened because, as I said earlier, parents were ashamed. They were embarrassed. They didn't want to talk. They didn't want to make it public that their beautiful son or daughter or brother or spouse had died with a needle in his arm in a McDonald's bathroom toilet. It spread because so many of those families believed that they were alone. It spread. I have another thought too. Theory that it spread because it started in states with too many counties, frankly, like Kentucky. What that meant was if you don't have violence in the streets, you don't have parents talking about it or families talking about it. You have doctors who are influential people who are the source of a lot of. The only place where you're going to see that this is a problem is really from the bodies, from coroner's offices. But in so many of the states, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, there were too many counties. The county budgets were strapped. They were thin. The talent pool, the number of people you could actually get to staff the coroner's offices was very shallow. And so a lot of times those numbers were missed. The budgets were not there to be able to fund the kind of death investigations. And so that was our warning system, and it was really kind of creaky and withered at that point. And one of the reasons I believe that we didn't see this as early as we ought to is because it happened in states where the counties were not fully funded. We relied on coroner's offices relied on local tax base. Appalachia was a canary in our societal coal mine, but by the time I got onto this story, it would have really spread far, far beyond that. It spread to the wealthiest suburbs, the middle classes or upper middle classes, Charlotte, North Carolina, place I spent a lot of time. The CDC maps now show us that this problem is in Tennessee, it's in Vermont, it's in Hawaii. Orange County, California is now a heroin beltway where Disneyland is. What I realized as I got into this was that the children of people who had benefited most from the expansions of our economy over the last 30 years, it was those folks whose children or family members in general, spouses, what have you, uncles, were getting addicted, turning to drugs and getting addicted to drugs, used of all things to numb pain. You look at their lives, you go, what pain? Life is perfect. That's when I realized that this was not just a crime book that I was right. I thought I'm a crime reporter by training, by first love, I guess, and I thought I was writing the great drug trafficking book. And as I got into it, I began to realize, no, this story is about something much, much larger. It was about what we had become as a country, who we had become as Americans. I'm just a reporter, but I was drawn to, inescapably, to certain conclusions. Seems to me that a lot of this has to do with the fact that we've spent 35 years, at least in this country, destroying community. We exalted the private sector, came to believe the free market was some infallible God. We began to admire wealthy business people, regardless of whether the way they made their money produced anything of value for our country or our communities. Meanwhile, we laughed at government, ridiculed it as inefficient, wasteful. Yet here's a story of a drug nightmare created by the private sector, unleashing what I believe to be the greatest threat to personal freedom in America today, which is opiate addiction. And as I was doing this story, the only people I could find to actually talk to who were fighting this quietly, sometimes thanklessly, were coroners, cops, public health nurses, ER docs, county drug counselors, jailers, DEA agents, all of whom were drawing a government salary. This problem is about profits being privatized. The Sackler family, which owns the Purdue Pharma, is now valued by Forbes at $14 billion, one of the wealthiest families in America, due to $35 billion worth of sales of OxyContin since the drug came out in 1996. All costs, I'm sure you're well aware, meanwhile, are borne by the public sector, by jails, courts, coroner's offices, county hospitals, police, prosecutors, etc. But as I got into this story, it seemed to me that it had even more, there was more to it than even that. This was a time in American culture, it seems to me, these years, when we believed in silver bullets, in that we didn't have to be accountable for our own personal behavior. Some of the great founding ideas of America, I think, got twisted in our pursuit of comfort, of convenience, self-reliance. Great American idea became isolation. Accountability became accountability for other people, and less so for ourselves. And that transformed into tantrums when public officials, doctors, cops, health workers didn't fulfill our every demand. When they didn't, we told pollsters we had lost faith in our institutions. We, as I said earlier, adopted unrealistic expectations of how much pain we should be asked to tolerate. We were Americans, therefore, entitled to a life without pain, seemed to a lot of us. And not just physical pain, but also emotional pain, psychological pain, societal hard things. We pursued comfort, convenience, lack of complications, and we wanted a quick fix to whatever ailed us. In politics, compromise became a dirty word, that we should all just do it alone. We had a president who said government is the problem, as if government was somehow separate from all of us and was something that was visited upon us rather than growing from our democracy. We wanted, I think, easy answers to complicated problems, and that we believe that old rules don't apply to us. Remember, these were years when we believed that many ball players could hit more than 60 home runs, when it had happened twice in the entire history of the sport, right? We believed that if we packaged together in securities massive numbers of poorly performing home loans, and Standard & Poor's marked that AAA, that was a fantastic place to invest our money. It was fantasy. We believed also that opiate painkillers, massively prescribed to almost every person without really concern for who that person was, that person's background or history. We believed that doing that would not somehow result in widespread drug addiction. We developed at the same time a hypersensitivity, as people who are fear pain will, to almost any offense. We took offense at almost anything, whether offense was actually intended or not. Too often Americans nowadays search to be offended. We luxuriate in the words, I'm so offended that kind of XYZ, whatever it happens to be, like a little bit like Scarlett O'Hara approach to life. We became ferocious, meanwhile, in our attempt to keep our kids from feeling pain or from the consequences of failure. We gave out trophies just for showing up. Part of all this, we developed a fear of the public sphere, so we dare not let our kids go outside. We want to bubble wrap them against any problem that they might encounter, any humiliation, any skinned knee, figuratively or literally. Parents have been prosecuted, literally prosecuted in this country for letting their kids go to the park alone. We had play dates instead of just going over and knocking on your neighbor's door, for goodness sake. My mom was from Iowa. She had a farm bell. We grew up in Southern California. Every afternoon, 6 o'clock, she'd go to the sidewalk, right? She'd ring that bell. There were 4 boys. We all knew when that bell sounded that it was time to run home for dinner. But why did she ring that bell? Because she didn't know where we were going to be, but one place we were not going to be. On a sunny Southern California afternoon was inside the house. Now, I've been back to that street, I don't know, a dozen times since coming back from Mexico, back to my hometown, and I have literally yet to see one human being on that street where I grew up. The park around the corner, beautiful park, where I played football, rode bikes, played basketball, empty constantly. In an era where we have tried to protect kids from all manner of pain, the Atlantic Monthly wrote that these kids are now demanding to be protected as well from painful ideas. They are demanding professors provide trigger warnings. I didn't even know this term until I read that story. Trigger warnings, which is a way of saying, professor, you must now warn me against any possible disturbing idea that might encounter in the readings that you assign to our school. That's why you go to college, is to be disturbed, right? Indeed, all brilliant people go to UC Berkeley, and I was very disturbed when I went to Berkeley. Okay? Unfortunately, at UC Berkeley, there is now a movement to ban people from talking just because their ideas are not what other people might consider to be valid ideas. I find this very disturbing. I'm a reporter. I have a zero tolerance policy myself for censorship. Sadly, a group of professors at one university wrote in defense of keeping out certain speakers on their campus, we are especially concerned with the impact speakers' presentations on students. Poor kids. These students often feel the injury most acutely and invest time and energy in rebutting speakers' arguments. You know, that's Heroin's America talking right there. As a culture, we acted as if private consumption, accumulation of stuff, was the path to happiness. We built into our suburbs a deep, sad isolation, and we called that prosperity. We embrace technology that connects us to the world but leaves us ignorant really about the guy across the street. And above all, we are deluding ourselves when we believe that we are somehow informed by 24-hour cable news. 24-hour cable news is just like heroin, one of the most pernicious influences in our society today. The way heroin addicts, when they get together, they all want to meet each other. They don't want to talk with anybody who doesn't know how to buy dope, use dope, what good dope is. That's exactly what 24-hour news, regardless of the format or the station, that's what 24-hour news has done to our body politic. And we have turned it off and cut it off in our household. The result, I think, of all this and much, much more, we could go on for a long time, is that we wound up as a country, as Americans, dangerously separate, isolated from each other. Kids no longer play in the street. Parks are underused. We feel pain from opposing ideas. Why then do we wonder that heroin is everywhere? Seems to me that our very search for painlessness, for convenience and comfort, led us to it. This is the story about the agony that you create in the pursuit of a pain-free life. Heroin is the final expression of values we have fostered for 35 years, a final expression of our fetish for the private at the expense of the public, for isolation at the expense of community. The final stuff for a culture, heroin is the final stuff for a culture convinced that accumulation of stuff is the path to happiness. Remember, heroin turns every addict into a narcissistic, self-absorbed, solitary, hyper-consumer. A life that finds opiates turns away from family, from community, and toward buying every day one product, the product that most makes being alone not just okay, but preferable. You know, I was a reporter early on in my career in the crack years. The hallmark institution of the crack epidemic was the crack house. Very public place normally. It was like a house on the street. All the addicts, the users would take it over. I went to a few of these. They were very scary places. The hallmark institution for this epidemic is the private bedroom. Private bedroom is such a symbol of our American prosperity. Every children demands to have his own or her own private bedroom now. We don't feel like we're good parents, and we don't provide that now. Right? That the private bedroom which is where every mother wishes her children would stay instead of braving the wilds of the park across the street and all the child molesters hanging out behind every tree. It's that private bedroom where kids today are hiding their dope, using their dope, and dying. No, this story is about much more, I think, than drug trafficking or drug marketing. Isolation is heroin's natural habitat. Heroin is a perfect symbol for how isolated we have become as Americans and how much we have killed off or ignored that would bring us together. I believe, therefore, more strongly than ever, that the antidote to heroin is not naloxone. It is community. You want to keep your kids off heroin? Make sure people in your neighborhood do things together in public often. Make sure your kids ride bikes outside. Let them skin their knees. Don't protect them. Let them fail. Don't protect them from the consequences of their failure. As I rummaged around for this story for a couple of years. I became to believe it really, despite all the horrible negatives, as really a powerful force for change in our society today. It seemed to me, what it really boiled down to was, it seemed to me to be calling us as Americans to re-examine how we've been living, and that we would be foolish to miss the opportunity that it provided. And today I want to talk about a few ways in which I think it is doing that. I think it is calling on us to remember how we achieve happiness. You think all of a sudden, this is the surreal part of the speech where you're taking lessons on how to achieve happiness from a crime reporter. But the pills were kind of the embodiment of our time, right? They were like no pain and no risk, right? All our pain taken care of, and there's no risk of addiction. Everyone said that. They're virtually non-addictive. But as part of this story, very strangely, and my friends would be aghast to hear this, I began reading philosophers about how we achieve happiness, because it seemed to me that all of a sudden became a crucial part of the story. We achieve happiness through finding meaning in life. Most of them agree. Philosophers I've read say finding happiness comes from working hard towards something, finding something that ignites your passion, and working hard toward being great at it, sacrificing a lot toward that goal, although it doesn't probably seem like sacrifice if you love it. And in the process, we generate a deep fulfillment that we call happiness. We achieve that most often in community, being around others, where we, as a species, are social beings. We know that we cannot buy happiness. Beatles told us that. But as a culture, we behaved as if we could. And the dope, as I said, is one final expression of that. I think this epidemic is asking us to rethink old dogmas, old ways of thinking. In red areas, pounded by this problem, people are rethinking the idea that you could just throw away the key, a cell for every addict that they supported for so long. They are asking now for Christian charity, that addiction be treated as a disease, lobbying for treatment over incarceration. That charity, I know from my earlier work, my earlier jobs, was not so evident earlier on when their kids were less affected. And today they have, I know, turned to government now that many of their kids are addicted. These are in areas that are quite red and sometimes very libertarian. They're advocating government adopt once taboo ideas like needle exchanges, civil commitments for addicts convicted really of no crime. But you know, it's in blue areas this is happening as well. The idea in those areas of treatment was always found a welcome reception, and jailing an addict was viewed as kind of anathema. Hence the cliche, what's become now really a cliche, is we can't arrest our way out of this. But in blue areas, those things are changing as well. So if we can't arrest our way out of this, where can we find more treatment beds? Strangely, and I think this state is showing it, one place you can find that is jail. Jail, in fact, seems to me the safest place almost for an addict. As any parent of an addict will tell you, opiates are mind-controlling beasts. A kid who complained about the least little household chore while sober will, as an addict, walk 5 miles through the snow to find his dope. Waiting for an addict to reach rock bottom and make rational choices to seek treatment sounds nice in theory, but it ignores the very nature of the drugs that we are talking about, while assuming that a private treatment bed is miraculously available whenever that person decides that he or she wants to occupy it. The reality is that unlike other substances, other addictive substances, with opiates, rock bottom is often death. Jail, therefore, can be unnecessary, maybe sometimes the only lever with which to encourage or force an addict to seek treatment before it's too late. In fact, it occurs to me that jail may actually be the best place to initiate recovery. It's in jail, it's in jail where addicts first interface with the criminal justice system before they commit crimes that will require them to go to prison. Normally in jail, once a person is detoxed and now is thinking clearly as opposed to the months on the street when he was addicted, it's in jail where addicts most often behold the complete wreckage of their lives, and it's yet for decades now, it's been at that very moment when we have plunged them into a jail that is predatory, boring, anything but helpful to recovery. I'd suggest it's worth looking at some of the 24 or more jails that you have around this state who are reimagining how jail can be. It's a radical idea. It's a beautiful idea. Jail is a center of recovery where addicts work from morning to night after they make their bed military style on their recovery. And there is being created, I believe, a new culture of nurturing in jail, unheard of in jails all across the country for decades now, that replaces the old counterproductive culture of predation and tedium. It's not a panacea. Addicts leaving there do relapse, but it does seem to me a better use of tax money than the way we've done jail up to now. I think it's calling on us to re-examine parenting choices. When I was a kid, I'd ask my parents for something expensive, although nothing costing $600 with a monthly service charge. And they would say no. I'd insist. They'd say no again, and I'd be disappointed for a month. That was, not all that long ago. We as parents apparently have stopped being able to endure our children's disappointment, their pain, if you will, except for it's at age 10. Every parent around simply can't abide the idea that their kids suffer the pain of being the only one without a cell phone. This epidemic is asking us the question of how safe it is for kids actually to be cooped up all day long. I'd like to see a study of the correlation between kids who are diagnosed with ADHD when they're 7 and those who then grow into opiate addicts, especially boys. Look, I was one. Boys are like dogs. They need to run every day, all the time. Keep a dog cooped up, and he gets loopy. It's the same way with boys. You keep them inside, they go nuts. All of this, though, I believe the opiate epidemic is calling us to do. We need to say no. A friend of my wife said kids need the vitamin no every day. No to video games, no to cell phones. Parents have full authority in their homes, but we've grown thin-skinned and can't bear that our kids cry, be unhappy, feel this glimmer of pain of not having something. That's not pain, that's disappointment. It seems to me that living with disappointment is one of the vitamins of a kid's soul. I think this epidemic, meanwhile, talking on a more national level, is asking us the wisdom of unleashing large quantities of legal, highly potent drugs as we're about to do with marijuana. People ask me whether I think now, after having done this story, I think drugs should be legalized, and I say, well, what about this story makes you think that legalizing drugs is a good idea? Look, you've got, this starts with legal drugs, right? It starts with massive amounts of legal drugs unleashed on a population. At the very least, this story ought to imbue us with a sense of caution and humility that we don't know it all, that we need to take it very, very very slowly. I happen actually to believe to favor marijuana legalization because I lived in Mexico, and I could tell you that if marijuana is a gateway drug, it most certainly is a gateway drug for all the Mexican traffickers. That's how you start. Dealing marijuana, growing marijuana, trafficking marijuana is how you start. Chapo Guzman was a marijuana trafficker first. I also believe that once it's legal, we can more easily study it in depth and mine all the benefits from that plant, whatever they are. But I also believe we need to use the model of what we did in Prohibition. In Prohibition, we regulated potency. We didn't say all liquor that was sold in Prohibition is somehow now legal. There was a lot of it. There was wood alcohol and turpentine. That was called liquor in Prohibition too. Today, the most potent pot is called marijuana, though it bears almost no relationship to naturally grown marijuana. It's 25%, 30% THC. That's like LSD. Has almost no relation to the marijuana back in the 1970s. Why it deserves legalization is honestly beyond me. I think it's calling us to stop believing easy answers to complicated questions, this epidemic. Now, people I know today are impatient for solutions, thinking that, gee, it's been a couple of years now. No, this has been going on for 20 plus years. I think we need patience. We got into this also, I would say, because as a culture we demanded easy answers to complicated problems. Complicated problems is the mystery of human pain. How do we deal with it? Pills for everybody. Today, Suboxone is presented as the solution. Too often, though, it seems to me that it risks being presented in isolation. Addicts need community to recover. And I suggest that when it comes to this, we take some care, again, some humility, some caution. We risk repeating what we did as a country, which was to throw pills at all manner of pain. Suboxone, I don't believe, is enough without the community of group therapy, of mentors, of nurturing an addict's self-reliance through reliance on others. Addicts today risk being just like the pain patient who got only pills when what she needed was a holistic approach to addressing her weight, her marriage, her job, her diet, her exercise. I was talking with neonatal nurses in North Carolina recently, and they said, you know what a baby born with this needs? Born addicted and withdrawals? I said, no, what's that? And they said, cuddling. Don't we all? Huh? But it was the idea was addicts, they need to know that they're not alone, that they're in this fight together. I think that's what we all need. I think that's what addicts need. I think this epidemic is asking us to not so unconditionally accept the private sector while demonizing government. I lived in Mexico for many years, and I could tell you down there one of the main problems facing Mexico is something we do not have here, and that is weak, dysfunctional, underfunded local government. It's why you cannot drink the water in Mexico because all the cities do not have the ability to actually build water treatment plants. Every time I returned from Mexico, I gained a deeper appreciation of our local government, of our system of government, which is agile, competent, and accountable. You can't pull apart a country managed so well at the local level. It's so important to understand what makes us strong. What makes us strong is local taxation, local governance, local participation. Go to a country that has none of that, and I think you'll see what I mean. I think, finally, this is calling on us to examine what we consume. In the middle of this story, I realized that our own personal choices had a lot to do with why we got here, and I stopped drinking sodas, stopped eating food that was advertised on TV. You know, all that's crap anyway, don't we? I mean, it's just junk. I started working out more. There was a personal accountability that I believe is part of this. But, you know, we also set up systems that pushed us in the direction where we're going. We subsidized our most addictive and fattening and least healthy food. So now that food was also not just fattening and addictive and not healthy, it was also the cheapest. It was like food like cheap Mexican heroin. High fructose corn syrup, chicken nuggets were engineered in a laboratory at Cornell University, crammed with salt and fat in order to be as addictive to as wide a population as possible. Finally, I think we got away from what's best. This epidemic is showing us that we got away from what's best about America, from community, from our own personal accountability, from just simpler lives. Along the way, we rid ourselves of things so essential to us that they have no price, and we have been invaded by cheap junk. We dug up a beautiful community pool called Dreamland, and we replaced it with Walmart. We did this in many ways all across America for many years, and heroin is what you get when you do that. Today, the supply of opiates on our street is so vast that getting into treatment can take months. Getting out is like Russian roulette. Football, the new great American pastime, is a gateway to heroin addiction. But that's what happens when you start as a culture believing in easy answers and silver bullets to complicated problems. The good news is there is no solution. We tried the solitary solution, the sexy solution. Look where it got us as Americans. Pills, solution to all our pain. A jail cell for every addict. I think it's time we stop believing there's an easy way out, that old rules don't apply to us because we're Americans. So we have no kind of need collectively for each other. The epidemic is calling on us to see how important community is. So no, there is no solution. There are many solutions, each part of a mosaic, a community of solutions, and happily, I think very happily, none of them is sexy. Not one will do the trick alone. Each is small, grows from an immersion in this problem, from communities working together over the long term. But that's how innovation happens. It's how it happens on the shop floor. The worker, the foreman, the software engineer, the accountant, all working together, making small incremental changes to make a better product over time. I don't see why a town or a county is much different. Seems to me we have to rediscover that great American self-reliance and realize, ironically, that self-reliance requires depending on each other, watching out for each other. We need to turn away from the idea that we do not have to compromise, we don't need each other, that we can all just get along on our own. To me, again, that's just heroin talking right there. The best good news is that this problem is no longer private, no longer hidden, no longer just a thin line of government employees fighting this alone, sometimes under threat of lawsuit. Parents are stepping out of the shadows, and that's very healthy. Doctors, however, still need to understand that they need to stop prescribing so many of these pills. There's no answer to this problem without that change. Not to cut people off, that's cruel, but a more judicious, careful approach to the use of these pills. Insurance companies need to expand the pain strategies they reimburse for to include more strategies that don't involve narcotic painkillers and need to begin to reimburse for medically assisted treatment. You folks who work in all this, public health workers, doctors, addiction counselors, on and on and on. I want to say that you are so important in all this, though it may not seem that other folks around you understand that. I want to ask you that though you may become discouraged, to keep on, though the numbers keep rising like some nasty high tide, just keep on. Don't become hardened. Don't lose energy. Your neighbors need you so badly, whether they know it or not. Your churches, your schools need you badly. From where I sit, it seems your work is essential to our country today. It will, however, and most likely not be recognized the way it needs to be. Because in life, this is an adult world we're talking about, in life, most real, solid change happens piecemeal, and piecemeal is not sexy. But have no doubt of your importance to the country today. We would be truly lost without you. I have faith that in time, your neighbors will thank you. Your county, your town will thank you. Your country will thank you as you keep working on all this. And for now, and in case you haven't heard it for a while, I want to say thank you very, very much.